Hey everyone, Ableton Certified Trainer Ian Gallagher, aka DJ IBG, here today to give you a vocal tutorial. Lately we've been getting a lot of comments and general questions at Warp Academy about vocal processing. This is probably because vocal processing is one of the hardest aspects of music production. First of all, if your recording isn't good, or if your singer can't sing in tune with feeling, well then no amount of vocal processing magic is going to save you. But let's say you have a quality recording and your singer is great. It's actually still a tricky thing to make vocals stand out and sit in your mix. But over the past year, I've been working on a rack that I think works quickly and effectively for me and my music, so I really wanted to share it with you guys. Today I want to show you this rack, why I use it, and how it works. And as always, if you want to grab it for yourself, it's a free download. So just click the link below and it's yours. All right, let's drop my vocal rack onto a track and open it up. First thing you may be surprised about is that there are a bunch of EQs and compressors. This is because in my experience, the best way to really dial in a great vocal sound is by sculpting the vocal in stages. I'm not saying it absolutely can't be done with just one EQ and compressor. It totally depends on the vocalist and the recording. But over the years, I don't think I've ever really gotten away with using less than 2 or 3 EQs and compressors on a single vocal track, just because vocals are very complex. I should also mention that there are lots of genre-specific approaches to processing vocals. So my approach today is definitely aimed at more of an electronic, pop, hip-hop style of processing vocals, because in those genres, you really want to get the vocal locked tightly into one spot. And that's why there's this need for a pretty extensive processing chain. You probably don't want to use this chain if you are producing a jazz record or acoustic singer-songwriter kind of stuff. That stuff is another video. For now, let's just dive into how I process vocals on an electronic kind of pop track. The first stage is a little preamp distortion. Whether or not I use this totally depends on the recording. The most important factor is really if the vocal was recorded with a nice preamp, like a Universal Audio or something, I'll usually delete this because it's not needed. But if the vocal wasn't, and you want to add a little crispiness off the bat and give it a little character, I'll dial in something from 5 to 12 decibels of light distortion here. Let's hear how it sounds on this track.
Feels like it don't mean a thing. Each moment that we had was stolen, and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. Moment that we had was stolen, and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. Moment that we had was stolen, and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. Moment that we had was stolen, and we've got to.
So it's subtle for sure, but there's a little more grit on here, which I definitely like. Okay, on to our first EQ. This first EQ is standard cutting out of low-end rumble that we just don't need. Again, depending on the recording and your vocalist, I typically set this between 80 to 150 hertz.
Each moment that we had was stolen, and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. Moment that we had.
That sounds good.
And we've got.
Now let's look at our first stage of compression. This is where I like to set my compressor to tame the wild peaks, the places where things are getting a little too loud for just milliseconds or brief moments of time. So we just want the compressor to only engage when there's a spike in the sound and then quickly back off. That's why I call it the peak chopper. It's just taking down the really fast peaks. I've set this guy up for a super fast attack and a very fast release. Not too much knee. Now, if you scan your vocal waveform, you can usually visually identify where the spots are that you need to tame. Like here, for instance, in this vocal.
And yet I
have the threshold macro mapped, so let's go ahead and use it to find a sweet spot.
something permanent. I turn around and then it's gone. Yeah. And yet I always plan for something permanent. I turn around and then it's yeah. And yet I always plan for something permanent. Yeah. And yet I always plan for something permanent. Yeah. And yet I always plan for something permanent. Yeah. And yet I always plan for something permanent. I turn around and then it's gone. That was stolen and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. That was stolen and we've got to return what
Notice this is not extreme compression. I'm just getting a little gain reduction on the louder words. You should definitely not be getting gain reduction on every word. If you are, raise that threshold up because you've gone too far. Again, we're taming the peaks here. Okay, our second EQ, things get more interesting. This is probably the most important EQ stage, actually. This is where I try to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the vocal in order to sculpt its overall character. So I'm going to do a sweep through with a boosted EQ bell and find a couple spots that annoy me. The goal here is when we A-B, we're going to be more pleased with the vocal with the EQ cuts. Let's see what happens.
What happened to forever now? Feels like it don't mean a thing. What happened to forever now? Feels like it don't mean a thing. What happened to forever now? Feels like it don't mean a thing.
Okay, yeah, here at about 350, there's kind of a muddy quality that just doesn't need to be there.
Feels like it don't mean a thing.
It sounds better if I make a big cut here.
What happened to forever now? Feels like it don't mean a thing. What happened to forever now? Feels like it don't mean a thing. What happened to forever now? Feels like it don't mean a thing. What happened to forever now? Feels like it don't mean a thing. What happened to forever now? Feels like it don't mean a thing. What happened to forever now? Feels like it don't mean a
Okay, here at about 1K, I think I'm gonna try another dip with EQ. Let's hear how it sounds.
What happened to forever now? Feels like it don't mean a thing. What happened to forever now? Feels like it don't mean a thing. What happened to forever now?
Yeah, that sounds good. I will be doing more EQing, but at this stage, I try to just get a couple of the big ones out of the way. Again, I just want to nail the general character of the vocal at this stage. Okay, compression 2, the glue. Now, you might have heard before that 2 compressors compressing a little are better than 1 compressor compressing a lot. To get real technical on you, this is because you wind up with fewer artifacts from modulation distortion. Regardless of the reason, I agree with the consensus that it sounds better usually to use 2 compressors. As opposed to my first compressor, the peak chopper, this is where I want to put on some heavier compression to squash the sound together a bit. I find that setting the threshold so that I'm getting a consistent 3 to 5 dB of gain reduction is a great place to start, and then it just depends on the vocal and what it needs. So let's loop up a section and see how we can get it to sound.
That we had was stolen and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. Each moment that we had was stolen and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. Each moment that we had was stolen and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. Each moment that we had was stolen, and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. Each moment that we had was stolen, and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. Each moment that we had was stolen, and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. Each moment that we had was stolen, and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. Each moment.
So you can probably hear that without the glue, the vocal's a little uneven, not really sitting in one place. But with the glue, I think the vocal sounds more in your face, but controlled. Again, this is also subtle. You don't want to just utterly clobber the vocal with compression here. All right, more EQing. Exciting stuff, right? Well, actually in this stage, it does start to get a little more exciting. This is where I like to give the vocals a lift, as the name implies. This is where I decide if the vocals need a boost in some way. Usually this is where I ask myself if the vocals need some brightness or some air, and mostly this involves a high shelf to varying degrees. I started around 8K and listen for a place where a little upper end lift brings the vocal to life. Sometimes, of course, this isn't needed, but also just a touch of high end shelf can really go a long way, so it's definitely worth some trial and error here.
Was stolen, and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. Each moment that we had was stolen, and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. Each moment that we had was stolen, and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. Each moment that we had was stolen, and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big. Each moment that we had was stolen, and we've got to return what we took to pay the price for dreaming big.
Cool, that sounds good. Just be careful not to put too much sizzle on the vocal at this stage. You don't want it to get too bright because you don't want your vocals to get brittle. But you gotta just use your ears, and every recording's different. Okay, now on to de-essing. Now, there are a bunch of really awesome third-party de-essers on the market. My favorite is probably FabFilters. But if you don't have one like that, it's actually fine because Ableton's multiband compressor can actually do a pretty good job of de-essing. So I've set it up here so that everything between 3K and 14K is getting compressed, which is essentially what most de-essers are doing. Now with this macro over here, I'll lower the threshold until I'm getting anywhere from 2 to 15 dB of compression. The key here is to listen for S sounds. It is a de-esser, of course, and adjust the threshold so that only those sounds are being reduced, but not so much that they're gone completely. Also, you can listen for F sounds because they have a similarly harsh quality.
It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. I turn around and then it's gone. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. I turn around and then it's gone. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. I turn around and then it's gone. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. I turn around and then it's gone. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. I turn around and then it's gone. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent.
Let's actually hear what it would sound like if I went way too far with de-essing.
It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan.
You can probably hear that that's way too much because the vocal is dull now, which is definitely not what you want.
Always plan for something permanent.
One caveat I got to mention is unfortunately you can't set the lower limit here above 3K. But if you want to adjust the upper limit of the compression, you can drag this slider down and adjust it according to your vocal. Sometimes I'll bring it down to as low as 7K. All right, the final EQ. This is where I do my last layer of EQ work. And these are usually very small adjustments, not big dips or big boosts or anything. Here is where I'll ask myself, are there still some annoying frequencies that I can remove? Does the vocal need a little more air? Or the opposite, is the vocal too thin? Have I gone too far? Does it actually need some low end to get a fatter sound? Well, first what I'll do is an EQ sweep and see if there are any frequencies that jump out.
Always plan for something permanent. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent.
Okay, I don't think 1K here is doing us many favors, so I'm going to do a tiny dip there.
It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always.
And I might try out a touch more high shelf.
It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent.
Or how about a touch of low shelf to give the sound some body?
I always plan for something permanent. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. It's like it should be clear.
Finally, I'm going to bring down this low pass until I just barely hear its effect. I just want to make sure that these super duper high frequencies are getting a little bit of taming.
It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. It's like it should be clear, and yet I always plan for something permanent. It's like it should.
All right, that wraps up the EQ and compression stages. In part 2 of this series, I'll be touching on how to use gating, delay, reverb, and widening to get a primo vocal sound. I hope to see you again then. In the meantime, peace.